Hello there everybody, Swandzz here, or Sarah, or Pint-Sized Palace, here today to make a video. So, as you may know, I have decided to start a new sculpting project and start making my own BJD for the second time. So, whenever you start a big project like this and share that with the internet, people are gonna have questions, which is awesome. I love that you guys are thirsty for knowledge, so I am here to try and help you. I would like to preface this by saying I am not a professional. Actually, technically I am a professional, but I am new to sculpting, just like you, so we are going to be learning along together. I want to start a new little mini series on my channel about sculpting a doll, where we're basically gonna go through all the steps from start to finish. And if you watch them in a row like you're supposed to, it should help you throughout your entire doll sculpting process. So this series is going to be updated as I make more progress, because like I've said, I have not completely finished a BJD yet, but I have gotten pretty far. I've been making some good progress. So today's video is the introductory video, and it's going to be sculpting a BJD from scratch 101, starting with your blueprint and what materials you're going to need to complete the project. Okay, so obviously you're starting to sculpt a doll. You need, first and foremost, to sketch a blueprint. I have mine here to show you, and I have shown this in a video before, but I'm gonna show it again. The blueprint is going to be a 1-to-1 scale blueprint, meaning exactly the same size you want your doll to be when your doll is finished. So this is my blueprint. Oh, I'm zoomed out as far as I can go. Let me back up. This is my blueprint, my 1-to-1 scale ratio for my doll that I'm working on. She's going to be 60 centimeters, so I have 60 centimeters measured out. And on a separate sheet of paper, I have measured out individual measurements for the doll. Now, that is probably the best way to do it. You don't necessarily have to do that if you're okay to eyeball things, but it's also very helpful to get one of those little rulers that you can basically close down on a piece to measure like thickness of stuff, just to make sure that the thickness of the body that you're sculpting is matching up with what you have as your blueprint. But so I'm gonna say that this is probably the easiest part, because all you have to do is draw what you want the doll to look like in the size that you want it to be, and then you're going to go ahead and kind of plan out your joints. So as you can see here, I have planned out like the red lines are the shape of the joint from the outside, and the blue lines are the joint from the inside, how far it fits inside the other pieces. The only advice I can really give you guys on this is just to study other dolls. It's going to be harder if you've never owned a BJD, but I've owned lots of BJDs, so I know how the parts are supposed to work, and therefore it made it a lot easier for me to figure out how I personally wanted to do the joints on my doll. If you've never had a BJD, you're gonna want to look up lots of videos about like body reviews could be helpful, because typically in body reviews people engage all the different joints and you can really see how they're working. I know I have a playlist of body reviews that's very big. It's an extensive playlist. I can link to that at the end of this video. And in that playlist, you'll see all kinds of reviews for different types of bodies that will show you in depth basically how the joints work. But like I said, it's going to be a lot harder if you've never had a BJD. But if you have a doll to reference, even if it's a smaller doll, like a tiny, or even if it's like a Hujo or something, it's still gonna help you, because it's all basically the same even when you get larger in scale. The joints typically always work the same way. So it's very helpful to have a BJD in real life as reference to help you sort of figure out how these joints are meant to work. Once you have your blueprint completed, you need to start thinking about what materials you're going to use, and namely what kind of clay, right? So there are tons and tons of different kinds of clays and different ways that you can sculpt a BJD, and there's no right answer when it comes down to exactly what kinds of materials to use. It really comes down to you as an individual artist and what materials you have the most experience with. The one type of clay I will say to absolutely avoid for sure is any like stone air dry clay that has a lot of shrinkage, because if it's wrapped around an armature, which these dolls are because they have a core, which we'll talk about. If it's wrapped around a core, it's going to have shrinkage and it's going to crack and break into a bunch of pieces, and that's not going to work for you at all. So do not use pottery clay, which is usually like a stone air dry clay, and typically when researching clays and like looking at their descriptions, they usually say whether or not they work wrapped around an armature or not. The different kinds of clays that you can use are paper clay. This is a type of air dry clay, but it's mixed with like a paper pulp. Then there is also air dry clay that is more like polymer clay, where it's the pulp in it is going to be like a plastic or something, but it is also air dry and it cures more like polymer clay if you have experience with that. Polymer clay is basically like a plastic based clay that you cure by baking in your oven, typically at like 285 degrees. Then you have epoxy sculpt, which is a two-part resin type clay that cures in the open air, but it takes about 4 hours, and it's a good clay except for you have to work with it quickly because once it's hard, it is hard. So those are the different types of clays that you can use, and now I'm going to tell you some name brands of different types of clays. Name brand paper clay that I've been using is Polyform, and it works really well. This is what it looks like. Mine's already been opened, as you can see. You can get it online, but I got mine from Walmart. It's like $6.97 for a package of it. There's also DAS or DAS brand paper clay, which is a higher quality paper clay that I don't know the exact price of, but I've heard good things about it, especially in terms of sculpting a BJD. Then you have Lawdall clay, which is also an air dry clay, but I don't think it's a paper clay. I think it's more like a plastic air dry clay like I was talking about earlier, but people use that for sculpting dolls all the time, and it's really raved about, but it is a lot more expensive. It's about $25 for a pound, whereas like the Polyform paper clay I was telling you about is $7 for 2.2 pounds, so there's a big difference in price. Next we have polymer clays like Super Sculpey and Fimo. Depending on what clay you use, you have to go about sculpting your BJD differently. All clays, no matter what you use, need to be surfaced with primer. But some clays, like paper clay, like the one that I'm using, needs to be reinforced with another kind of clay. So what I'm going to do with my doll is sculpt her, the majority of her, out of paper clay, and then coat her in a layer of epoxy to strengthen her, because typically paper clays and air dry clays can break apart during the mold making process and basically ruin your original doll, which you do not want to happen. So depending on what type of clay you choose to use, you may or may not need to reinforce it with something else. I have sculpted a head out of polymer clay in the past, and it did not need to be reinforced with another kind of clay. I just coated it with surfacer or primer and it was good to go. I made a mold out of it. It was perfectly fine, and that was my Nima head. So it really depends on the kind of clay you're going to use. What I do recommend is that you use several different types of clay. So if you're sculpting a doll, you might want to do the very first like layer with a cheaper paper clay like Polyform or the DAS brand, and then that way you can build on top of that in layers with other kinds of clay. So Law Doll clay, for example, is renowned for being really great for figure and doll sculpting. So you can do your first couple layers with paper clay, and then coat that paper clay after it's cured and finish sculpting your doll in Law Doll. That's going to save you money, seeing as how you're not doing the entire thing with Law Doll, and then it's also going to reinforce your paper clay. So as you can see, there are a lot of different ways to sculpt a doll clay-wise. There's many different kinds of materials that you can use, but it's very important to make sure that the materials that you use are going to hold up over time and they're not going to fall apart during the mold making process. The other kinds of materials you're going to use also vary on what you're comfortable using as an artist. Typically you're going to need sandpaper, sculpting tools, dowels, different like size balls and things to use when trying to make joints and stuff like that. But you can also go as far as to get a Dremel, which is also very helpful when you're trying to like shape out eye wells or something, or drill out joints or elastic channels and stuff like that to really drill them out evenly. So a Dremel can be extremely helpful. I know that not everybody has access to a Dremel, so you can definitely do it without a Dremel, but I mean, it does make it easier, so that is something you might want to pick up. Most of this stuff, if not all of this stuff, can be picked up at, your local craft store and things like that. Now for primer, I have been using Rust-Oleum brand automotive primer, and it has worked very well for me. I do have some experience with sculpting and casting because, as you may or may not know, I sculpted a doll head and had it professionally cast by Miro Doll. She was primed with Rust-Oleum brand automotive primer, which worked really well for me. You want to make sure that you guys have all the tools necessary to sculpt and carve, so that's gonna be, X-Acto knives, box cutters, sharp things. So if you are a younger person, you might want to make sure that you have like a parent or an older sibling, like an adult or somebody, maybe even an art teacher, somebody who's going to be able to help you use those dangerous tools, because I'll tell you guys, I've already cut myself like 3 times. I literally just cut myself today with an X-Acto knife. So it is definitely not, for the feeble of heart. I'm trying to focus on that cut, but it won't. It doesn't want you to see it. Whatever, I cut myself today. These materials, these tools, I should say, are very sharp, and just one little slip of the finger and you're gonna cut yourself. So you need to be very careful when it comes to carving, which there is a lot of. The Dremel, I've never hurt myself with a Dremel, even though I have slipped and hit my finger. Usually, I've never made myself bleed with a Dremel, so I'm not saying that you should use one unsupervised. I'm saying that might be a safer tool. The last thing that we're going to discuss in this video is making your form, your tape form for inside your doll. I will have a video where I go into extreme detail with that and I actually show you guys how to make a tape form, but I'm just going to tell you basically the rough idea and the materials that you're gonna use right now. So I made the form for the inside of my doll with floral foam, which was really, really great because basically, I'll throw up a picture of what it looked like. I put the foam down next to my blueprint and basically drew the shape onto the foam and then carved it with a knife. Was able to stick my different floral foam pieces together with wire and then wrapped them all in tape. The reason why I wrapped them in painter's tape is because I didn't want that weird porous floral foam texture inside my doll, because that core gets removed later. You can also try wrapping it with plastic wrap, but that didn't work well for me. I've seen people do that and it has worked for them, but I couldn't get my paper clay to adhere to the plastic wrap and it didn't work for me. So I don't know if it depends on what kind of clay you're using or what. You can also make your tape form from styrofoam or aluminum foil or paper balls, or basically anything to give you a rough shape that you're going to then wrap in tape. So what this shape is, it's the core of your doll. So when you cut your doll into joints, it will be hollow. So this is the torso of my doll so far. And when I initially sculpted her, she was in one piece. This whole torso was one piece, and it had the core inside of it. So then later I was able to cut her into joints, as you can see, and pull the core out, and now she is nice and hollow. So that is what your core is going to do for you. And like I said, we will go into depth in another video about exactly how to make the tape form and stuff like that. But it is a very important step because you can make yourself a lot of work if you don't do it correctly. It is very important to stick to your blueprint when making your core, your tape form core, when, you know, sculpting everything. When doing the joints throughout the entire process, it's important to stick to your blueprint because that's going to keep you on task and make sure that your doll comes out in the correct size. And not just that, but it's going to give you a reference for what you want visually, because it's hard sometimes to stay on track if you don't have a good visual reference for what it is that you want. So sticking to your blueprint is extremely important, and that is something that you definitely want to remember to do. Just to recap, all the materials you're going to want to get before you start your doll, including the materials you need for your tape form and your blueprint. Okay, so that concludes this video. I hope that you guys found this information helpful. Hopefully it wasn't too overwhelming. This is our first introductory video, and the next step is going to be making a core, a tape form for the doll, and showing you guys exactly how you're going to do that. So stick around to see that video if you are hoping to make your own doll and you want some guidance. I love you guys. Leave any questions for me in the comment section below and I'll answer them to the best of my ability, and I will catch you in the next video. Bye! Okay, and click all of my little buttons, the subscribe circle or the video or playlist that is listed below, and I'll catch you guys in the next one. Bye!